Stephen Jones visited Rogers Museum in Southwark Street, drawn by its reputation for waxen horrors. Instead of being disappointed, he was fascinated by the unique and imaginative exhibits, including monstrous creations from mythology and darker legends. Jones learned about George Rogers, the museum's creator, who had previously worked at Madame Tussauds but was discharged due to his sanity and secret worship practices. Jones became friends with Rogers, who shared his passion for teratology and the iconography of nightmares. Rogers' workroom was a dimly lit crypt filled with waxen body parts, costumes, and paints. Jones noticed a door with a peculiar symbol, which he recognized from the forbidden book, Necronomicon. As their friendship grew, Rogers shared tales of his mysterious trips and claims of having read ancient, monstrous books. One night, after drinking whiskey, Rogers boasted of discovering hidden, tangible evidence of primal life cycles and communication with other dimensions. Jones was skeptical, but Rogers was serious, implying that some of his exhibits were not artificial. Their friendship cooled as Jones continued to visit the museum, fascinated by Rogers' wild tales and hints of dark rituals. The tension peaked in September when Jones heard a strange sound coming from Rogers' workroom. In the museum's great vaulted basement, a strange yelp echoed, sending chills down Jones's spine. The three attendants exchanged odd glances, and one, a dark foreign-looking fellow named Orabona, smiled eerily. Jones remembered no dogs were allowed in the museum. When he tried to investigate, Orabona stopped him, saying Mr. Rogers was out and no one was allowed in the workroom during his absence. Jones left, curious about the yelp and the mysterious workroom. He explored the neighborhood, finding a dark alley and a dim courtyard behind the museum. Despite Orabona's claim, Jones saw no dog, but noticed 3 small windows of the basement workroom. He peered in, seeing a glow of light at the farther end of the apartment, which seemed suspicious. The light came from an inner side of the room, near a heavy plank door with an abnormally large padlock and a cryptic symbol. Jones returned to the museum, eager to see Rogers. The attendants were leaving, and Orabona eyed him with sly amusement. Jones found Rogers in an unusual mood, boasting about surviving elder gods and nameless sacrifices. Rogers seemed increasingly confident, glancing at the padlocked inner door and a piece of burlap on the floor. Jones grew nervous, unsure about mentioning the afternoon's oddities. Rogers rambled on, speaking of a ruined city in Indochina and an oblong swimmer in darkness. He hinted at a discovery, saying it was bigger than anything he'd found before. The showman glanced queerly at the padlocked door, speaking of a long ritual in the 8th Pinacotic fragment and a discovery in Alaska. Rogers and Orabona explored ancient ruins, finding an ivory throne and a mysterious entity that needed sacrifices to come alive. They shipped the entity to London, where Rogers performed rituals and sacrifices to awaken it. Orabona opposed the idea, fearing what the entity would become. Rogers showed Jones, a skeptic, photographs of the ruins and the entity, which was finally awakened after a sacrifice. Jones was horrified by the remains of a tortured dog, which Rogers claimed was the entity's work, not his own. Rogers revealed the entity's true form, a monstrous, cyclopean creature with 6 limbs, crab-like claws, and a bulbous head with fishy eyes and a proboscis. In a dimly lit room, Jones examined a strange creature covered in dark, slender tentacles. Its eyes and proboscis seemed to exude hate, greed, and cruelty. Rogers, the creator, claimed it was a god, and he was its priest. Jones was disgusted and advised Rogers to destroy the creature and take a break. Rogers refused, believing Jones was afraid of the creature's power. Rogers challenged Jones to spend the night alone in the dark exhibition room, surrounded by wax figures, to prove they were just effigies. Jones agreed, hopping to prove Rogers' imagination was running wild. Rogers locked Jones in, warning him not to try it unless he was very sure of his skepticism. As Jones sat in the darkness, he began to feel uneasy, surrounded by morbid objects. He wondered why he had humored Rogers, but felt a fellow artist's sympathy for the man's genius. Jones hoped to help Rogers quietly overcome his growing mania. In a museum chamber, Jones felt isolated and uneasy, surrounded by wax figures that seemed to come alive in the darkness. He heard a distant clock strike midnight and wished for some sound to break the silence. Rogers, the creator of the wax figures, had boasted that no mice or insects ever came near the place, which Jones found curious. As he waited, Jones's senses became heightened, and he started to imagine strange sounds and movements. He saw floating specks of light that seemed to take on curious patterns and felt a chill in the air. The wax figures appeared to have an odd smell, like specimens in a natural history museum. Jones's imagination began to run wild, and he thought of Roger's insane picture of a wildly carved chamber with a cryptic throne. He wondered if the wax figures were not all artificial, and if Rogers had been to Alaska. The proximity of the waxen shapes started to unnerve Jones, and he tried to shut his eyes to block out the images. But even with his eyes closed, the strange patterns of light specks became more pronounced. Suddenly, Jones began to imagine even more hideous creatures, like Black Tsathoggua and a lean, rubbery night gaunt. He braced himself to keep from screaming and tried to use his reason to keep the phantoms at bay. When he flashed his light again, he saw the wax figures, but even they seemed to be trembling. He suspected that something was moving beyond the canvas partitions, screening off the adults-only alcove. Jones walked toward the alcove, trying to shake off his fears, but his imagination called up more terrifying creatures, like Yog-Sothoth and Nofke. He knew it was all just his imagination, but he couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. As he returned to his seat, he heard the distant clock boom a single stroke, and he knew he had a long wait until morning. In a workroom, Jones heard strange noises and felt an eerie presence. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but soon he heard footsteps and a voice chanting to an unknown horror. The voice was human and familiar. It was Rogers, who had gone mad and was planning to sacrifice Jones to a devil god. Jones realized he had to act fast to save himself. He pretended to be unconscious, then suddenly sprang into action, grabbing Rogers' throat. The two engaged in a desperate struggle, with Rogers using every trick to try and kill Jones. Jones used his athletic training to defend himself, and eventually he managed to overpower Rogers. As he bound Rogers with cords and belts, he found a key ring that would allow him to escape. Jones left the workroom, determined to find help and bring an alienist to take care of Rogers. In a dark and eerie warehouse, Jones confronted the sinister showman, Rogers, who had a twisted obsession with creating wax effigies. Rogers revealed that he didn't create the effigies, but rather preserved them, and that he had made a pact with a monstrous being, Rantegoth, to bring it to life. Jones was horrified as Rogers described how he would turn people into waxen effigies, including Orabona, who would be next. Rogers begged Jones to let him go, promising to share the power that Rantegoth would bring him. As Jones refused, Rogers began to scream and howl, eventually stopping to listen intently. He claimed that Rantegoth was coming, and Jones could hear it splashing in a tank beyond a padlocked door. The madman's confidence was contagious, and Jones's imagination ran wild with the idea of a monstrous creature lurking beyond the door. Suddenly, Jones heard the splashing and patting sounds, and his phobic paralysis took over. He was convinced that Rantegoth was real and approaching. The stench from the cracks in the door was overwhelming, and Jones's sanity began to unravel. He thought he saw a black paw ending in a crab-like claw, and his fear paralysis turned into frenzied automatic flight. Jones experienced a terrifying night at the museum, where he encountered a mysterious figure and witnessed unspeakable horrors. He fled the scene, but his memory of the events was hazy. When he recovered, he began to question what was real and what was just a product of his fevered imagination. He returned to the museum, where he met Orabona, who was now in charge. Orabona revealed that Rogers, the mastermind behind the museum's exhibits, had left for America suddenly. Jones was shown a new specimen, the sacrifice to Rantegoth, which was a masterpiece of horror created by Rogers. The exhibit depicted a monstrous creature with a crushed, distorted human victim, whose face bore a striking resemblance to Rogers. Jones was horrified and fascinated by the exhibit, which seemed to hold him captive. Jones examined the wax face, noticing the perfect reproduction of the dog's wounds. But there was something odd on the left cheek, as if the sculptor tried to cover a mistake. It horrified Jones, reminding him of the night Rogers was attacked, scratched on the same cheek. Overwhelmed, Jones fainted. Orabona kept smiling.